For most of my life, even though I was a Christian at a pretty young age, for most of my life, I never really heard anyone talk about Jesus as though he was anything other than a historical figure. Even in school, talking to friends and people who were not Christians, I mean, it seemed like, for the most part, everyone accepted the idea that Jesus was a real guy. Whether you thought he was God or not was this whole separate issue, but the idea that he had existed seemed to be undisputed, at least in my own personal experience. But as I got older and got into my high school age, I started to hear more often this objection that some people believed that Jesus had never lived, that he himself was part of a mythology that Christians had created over time, that there never had been a person named Jesus who was born. He'd never lived, he never died of crucifixion, that all of this was just part of the myth, that Jesus himself was not a real historical person. Well, this is very foundational. The idea that Jesus lived is foundational to Christianity. You know, I want to be a Christian because it's true, but if I'm going to believe that this guy Jesus lived and died for my sins, then it needs to be true that he really lived, that he really existed. So it kind of begs the question, I mean, is there good evidence to believe that Jesus himself even existed historically? Even before we get to the question about whether he was God, did Jesus even live? Was he ever born? Did he ever die? I think there are actually some good reasons to believe that Jesus is a true historical person. One thing that I never see, at least in my personal experience, I've never seen any person argue that the disciples, the followers of Jesus, or the people who said they were followers of Jesus, the earliest Christians, that they did not exist. And I think it's easy to see that they existed because these people not only wrote letters and books, which ended up being in our Bible, they not only had different historical impact, but they had followers that they taught, essentially their own disciples, who then wrote about them and what they had done and what they'd passed on, what teachings they had. And so it's clear that the disciples, the people who said that they knew Jesus and walked with him and said that they were passing along Jesus' teaching, that they really lived, that they are all historic people, that they really existed. And the question more comes down to is the guy they're talking about, Jesus. They keep, all these real historical people keep talking about this guy Jesus who lived and died and rose from the dead. Were they telling the truth, or are they essentially creating a mythology about Jesus? Well, we know that these followers of Jesus were writing books pretty early. Jesus, supposedly died in the mid-30s AD. Well, the first part of the New Testament that was written is written about the mid-50s. So about 20 years or so after Jesus supposedly died. The New Testament, we often think about the Bible as being like one book, but the Bible is made of many books and letters, and the New Testament itself is a collection of books which tell the story of Jesus and letters which were written by people in the church to other Christians talking about their faith and religion. And the earliest thing that was written in the New Testament is the book of 1 Corinthians. It's a book written to the city of Corinth by a guy named Paul, who says he's an early follower of Jesus. In fact, Paul claims to have had an encounter with Jesus. Now, regardless of whether you believe his claims that Jesus is God, it's hard to dispute the fact that Paul is writing very early after the time that Jesus supposedly lived. And as he's writing to the city of Corinth, he's mentioning Jesus. And it's clear that there's already a robust religion that has formed around the idea that Jesus is God. He is in a separate part of the world writing to the city of Corinth, discussing religious issues that they all share in common, religious beliefs that they all believe together. So very quickly after this supposed life of Jesus, Christians are already in existence. They're already writing about a pretty well-developed religion, and they're already making the claim that Jesus, not only that Jesus is God, but more foundationally that Jesus lived, that there was a guy named Jesus. Now, this is so early in history that many of the people who would have been around Jerusalem when Jesus is supposedly doing all these public works would know whether or not the stories about Jesus are true or not. Because remember, Jesus didn't die that long ago. And if now there's people writing letters and forming religions over the idea that this guy lived just 20 years ago, well, it's going to be hard to argue that this person was made up whole cloth. In fact, it would be really easy if you wanted to destroy the new religion of Christianity in its early days, that all you would need to do is prove that, well, that guy that Paul and all these other apostles, that Peter and Mark and Matthew and everybody's talking about, that guy never even lived. But we don't actually see that in history. We don't ever see any record that Jesus does not exist. The early Jewish people in Israel would have wanted to remove any type of momentum that the early Christians would have, because now Christianity is springing up and it is a competitor religion to Judaism, which is the common religion in Israel. So those religious Jewish leaders might want to have just mentioned, hey, all you Christians, that guy Jesus never even existed. I mean, that would be pretty easy to take all the wind out of the sails of the early Christians, but you don't see that. Instead, you see Christians early on writing about this guy Jesus, and much of the New Testament is written fairly shortly thereafter. And then you see that even historical people who are the disciples of the disciples, they're talking about Jesus as though he lived, and these are guys who are living essentially one generation after the disciples of Jesus. So pretty early in history, there's lots of discussion amongst Christians about this guy Jesus. Now, there is some discussion outside of Christianity, but typically it's people talking about the Christians themselves. Jewish people, Greek people, Romans, who are saying, hey, historians who are saying, hey, there's these Christian people, and they all say that there's this guy Jesus that they follow. So we know that Christianity starts really early. We can see it from not just the Christian writings that are religious writings, but also these secular or non-Christian sources that are at least mentioning that Christianity existed. Okay, now they're not saying that Jesus is God, but we can see that pretty quickly after the time that Jesus supposedly lived. There's all of a sudden a bunch of literature about him. There's other people talking about, there's a bunch of followers of Jesus. So there's certainly some type of impact. And so in some ways we can see the impact that Jesus has on the world around him suggests that there is a Jesus itself. I think we can also look at the lives of the apostles and the disciples, the people that would have known whether this is a true story or not. There's pretty tremendous religious persecution amongst the early Christians. And some of the disciples, the early followers of Jesus, end up being persecuted to the point where you got people getting exiled to out of the country to islands. You got people who are getting killed for their beliefs. Now, not every disciple of Jesus may or may not have actually been martyred, but we know that some were, and some, like John, end up getting exiled. Over time, the disciples, as they're going around telling the story of Jesus, they end up traveling really far from each other. Some go to Africa, some go to Rome, some stay in Israel, some go towards India, and they're trying to get as far as they can to spread the gospel far and wide. They're all separated and this is 2,000 years ago. Even sending a letter is going to be very difficult and take a long time. There's very little way for them to communicate. So the fact that they can, under persecution, sometimes even persecution to death, under this tremendous amount of pressure, you still have people who are saying, no, I'm telling the truth. I'm willing to die because I know I'm telling the truth, that Jesus was a real guy who lived. They're making more claims than just that he lived. They're making claims that he's God, that he raised from the dead. But the basic idea that Jesus lived, there's a bunch of people who are getting persecuted and are suffering for the idea that they just won't recant this statement that Jesus really lived. They're dying for that statement. So I think it's a little hard to understand why, if this was a made-up story that Jesus never lived, that all these people who said they knew him personally would allow themselves to be persecuted. You'd think at least one of those people who knew better, who knew that they were lying, would be like, we made it up. Don't banish me, or banish me but don't kill me, or whatever. I've had enough of this. I'll come clean. But there's no historical record of any of those early followers ever recanting their statements. In fact, every historical record we have says that they went through their entire lives devoted to the idea that Jesus really lived. I think there's great reason to believe that Jesus is a real historical person. You see the impact he had on the lives of those around him. And you do see early Christians writing about Jesus. Some of the Gospels are written by people who say, knew Jesus personally. I was there when he made these statements, when he gave these speeches, and I'm going to document them myself before I die so other people can see it. But most people would not consider, most secular people would not consider that to be historical. You know, they would say, hey, when Matthew writes his gospel, you can't trust Matthew as a historian. He's writing about miracles Jesus happened or, performed, and that Jesus came back from the dead. He's writing crazy stuff. You can't trust him. He's biased. He's a Christian. So even though Matthew lived at the right time and says he knew Jesus, they would argue that, hey, some people would argue that he doesn't count as a witness, or he doesn't count as a true historian. But I would just ask you this. If we're looking for a historian in history who wrote about Jesus' life, a historian who said Jesus lived and throughout his life performed miracles and claimed he was God, and then he got crucified for his beliefs, and then 3 days later he rose from the dead, and he appeared to all these people. If you're looking for a historian who would document those things but not be a Christian, what kind of person are you really looking for? I mean, who would you really be describing? Who would really believe all those things about Jesus but not be a Christian? In fact, many of the people who end up becoming Christians in the early Christian church are people who were skeptical at first, but because of the things they saw in Jesus' life, became Christians, and then after they're Christians, start producing Christian literature, writing the teachings of Jesus, the story of Jesus, different religious principles that Jesus would have wanted people to follow. That's how they become the Christian. And so I don't know if we're looking for, we can't believe Jesus is a historical person unless a Roman guy says that Jesus lived and performed miracles and died and rose from the dead. I mean, we're probably asking for too much from the historical record. I don't think it's reasonable to think that nobody existed, that Jesus didn't exist, and all of Christianity sprung up from nothing. I think that goes beyond a reasonable explanation. I think truly when we look at what happened in history, that all of a sudden there's this religion that springs up, and that all the followers, those early followers, are saying that they knew this guy personally, and they're willing to even die for their belief that this guy really lived and that they really knew him. I think the most reasonable thing to believe is, yeah, Jesus was a real person. He must have lived, because you can see the tremendous impact he had on the lives of the people who were in his life.